Initially, this wasn't a video I was planning on making. If you'd asked me a couple of months ago if I was going to, I'd have said no, and many did. But as people asked more and more, I realised that it would be stupid of me to not do it. And so while I was streaming on Twitch one evening, I fielded a poll, and the results were pretty unanimous. So if you want to thank anyone for this, thank them. I have a love-hate relationship with Assassin's Creed. There are some Assassin's Creed games that I adore, and there are some that I simply just can't stand. And while well-thought video essays and critiques can tell you exactly what I think about each game individually, sometimes people just want to know where you feel they stand with each other. And so this video will be me giving my opinions and telling you my Assassin's Creed ranking list for 2021. Will it be a carbon copy of previous ranking lists, just with Valhalla added in? No. Tastes change over the years. My opinions on some of the games have shifted. We see where the games lead in the sequels, and that may bring it up or it may take it down a peg. Some games are just unapologetically total arse. Some are dead average that don't compel me one way or the other. And others are brilliant, and I'll try my best to explain my position on them as we talk about them. So there's no confusion, this ranking will not include the side games such as the Chronicles games, or Bloodlines or Liberation, because those games aren't AAA and therefore didn't have the same sort of budget or workforce, and therefore comparing them to the main games would be unfair, as most of them would be right at the very end. I have found in the past that people can get a little pissy that you've missed out Liberation or the Chronicles games. They never mention Bloodlines, funnily enough, even though if there's any single one of these side games that's actually going to get somewhere other than dead last on this list, it would have been that one. But if I were to include these smaller scale side games, people would complain that it's not fair, and they'd probably be more correct. And of course, as a final disclaimer before we get cracking, this is all of course in my opinion. You don't have to agree with me. The comment section is open for people who wish to discuss their opinions in more detail with one another. All I ask is that people keep it respectful. That being said, I know it's going to be fucking carnage, and don't know why I even bothered asking. And so with that said, please do enjoy this video of me ranking the Assassin's Creed games for 2021. If there's one Assassin's Creed game that my distaste for can be described as genuine hatred, it's Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I don't even know where to begin with this game. Assassin's Creed Odyssey makes me very sad. There's no assassins, no Templars. You're an eagle-bearing Misthios in a flat open-world RPG ancient Greece with nothing actually interesting to see or do outside of imbalanced level curves designed to make microtransactions seem appealing, absurd amounts of dull fetch quests and filler non-content. There's no real charm to the game, it lacks character on every single level. The narrative is like a really bad but elaborate fanfiction that loses sight of the franchise it's meant to be a part of, and the protagonist's gender choice really throws off any chance for an identity in the protagonist, especially if you're just going to turn around and say that one choice is canon. What was the point in throwing in a male variant of the protagonist in there if all it does is force all the dialogue to be gender neutral, and the end result is you don't feel like the character is in the world, you feel like the character is just on it. It's honestly just soulless rubbish. The DLCs take this a step further, to the point where the game seems self-aware about its own lack of soul by giving you absurdly inconvenient objectives, tonally inconsistent quests designed to poke fun at players for trying to take a franchise that once took itself seriously. And honestly, this is the only Assassin's Creed game I've ever vowed to never waste time playing again, because it's just that out of touch with the brand it represents that it physically hurts to even think about. It's genuinely a dreadful Assassin's Creed game, and people will ask if I think there's a good game in here at all, regardless of the Assassin's Creed aspect, and no, there's really not. Regardless of how I try to look at it, it's just a genuinely miserable experience. This is probably one of the worst games that I've ever played. Odyssey often took the piss with too few Assassin's Creed elements, but Syndicate often went the other direction, taking a lot of Assassin's Creed elements and just ripping into them for giggles. While Victorian London is a fascinating setting for any game, the city in this game doesn't really feel like it lends itself too well to Assassin's Creed specifically. It's got a good atmosphere, but beyond this, the game just devolves into total madness. Jacob Fry is annoying. Evie Fry I quite like, but she gets sidelined in favour of Jacob's annoying antics. The game is full of 4 pointless Jacob missions to every interesting Evie one, and that imbalance is never made good on. Often impactful moments are also thrown away for the sake of a cheap laugh, with a lot of the jokes not landing and some of them just outright not making any sense. As for the approach to the history aspect, there are loads of historical figures just crammed into London, where they're introduced with lower thirds just to make sure that you didn't miss that that was Charles Dickens or Charles Darwin. As far as the antagonists go, they couldn't use the historical figures because it might upset the descendants if their ancestor was an Assassin's Creed villain, so they had to make up a bunch of characters to use as the antagonists. So it's not rooted in history there, and it doesn't feel like what you're doing has any impact as a result. They're also all named like dramatic over-the-top comic book British aristocrats, but the main Templar conspiracy is no longer intertwined with history in a way that makes unraveling it seem like a learning experience. The end result is the entire game just feels like a parody of what it's actually trying to be. Beyond this, the game relies too heavily on uninteresting mechanics such as kidnapping characters because yes, you need to do that a lot, running a fucking gang because being an assassin is just not enough anymore, and the rope launcher which you had to rely upon to actually navigate Victorian London as the setting didn't lend itself too well to parkour systems. The game in itself is fine, but I think my biggest issue with Syndicate is nothing necessarily outrageous, but rather my lack of things to say beyond what I've already said. It's just sort of forgettable. In the number 10 spot, we have Assassin's Creed Rogue. Rogue flips the script a bit and tells us the Assassin's Creed-styled narrative from the perspective of a Templar, though this Templar is an assassin defect who functions as an assassin just working for the Templars. The game doesn't really show an alternate perspective, but rather just shows the Templars as assassins and assassins as Templars. But of course, now you can kill civilians. Yippee. It's a shame, the concept of an alternate perspective could have been really thought-provoking, but because it's just so blurred, it doesn't really manage to be that gripping. The gameplay is the exact same as Black Flags with minimal adjustment, purely because Ubisoft didn't want to miss out on sales during the generation switch, making a game for the Xbox 360 and PS3 alongside Unity, which released for the Xbox One and PS4 on the same day no less. This game was precious resources I'm certain Unity could have done with considering the state of that game on launch. And while I kinda like this game to a limited extent, I honestly feel like it has no business existing. It does tie into Unity, but I don't think Unity makes good on that tie-in to justify this game being made to begin with, which is unfortunate for Rogue because it's just there. Nobody really knows why beyond sales. Assassin's Creed Unity on release was a broken mess, and a lot of people would say that it's fixed. Many people will claim that they had no issues with Unity even on launch, which is weird because they must have been playing a totally different game to me. Unity even now is very far from polished, yet people claim it's great after the patches. I disagree. Unity on launch was fundamentally broken. Now, it's still a big messy bug fest if you keep your eyes open. Bugs and horrid performance issues are rife even now. That being said, that's not the only issue with this game. The gameplay tries to be smooth but winds up being the complete opposite. It may look it, with a parkour system that's aesthetically pleasant when you get it flowing, and when mastered can be good fun, but you can see the animation switching and it can often break down the aesthetic. The actual feeling in controller can be quite clunky in the process. The combat and stealth in Unity I actually really like when it behaves, though I honestly believe the former could benefit from some more aesthetic variety in the finisher moves. But another huge letdown area in Unity is its story. I feel the character of Arno is held back a lot by the love interest plot that takes up the majority of the game. The plot is also very short, though I think Ubisoft thought you wouldn't notice considering they added in a level system of sorts that actually forces you to do other stuff. It poorly disguises how short the sequences actually are, some being as short as 1 or 2 missions. Unity's weak narrative has its lack of flesh to blame. The modern day is laughably bad as well. As for side content where it focuses on gameplay, it's fine but gets very samey very quickly. The same can be said for the co-op, though playing with friends is definitely a huge bonus in the game's favour, but the novelty of it does expire pretty quickly. Where it's story focused, such as the Paris stories, the side content is just rubbish, as they're as uninspired and minimal as possible, which makes them missable. The murder mysteries, however, give a little bit of life to this open world, which is a fascinating sentence to say. Unity isn't without its silver linings, but I'd argue that even if by some miracle all the technical blips were patched out, it'd still be far from what I'd consider to be a great game. With Assassin's Creed 3, most fans find themselves pretty firmly in either one of two camps. There's a camp that loves this game and sees it as one of the better Assassin's Creeds, and I can appreciate why, but I fall into the other camp. Assassin's Creed 3 could have been so much more than it was. The main story I found wasn't fleshed out as well as it perhaps could have been, and a lot of the details were left out that could have made this game so much more interesting narrative-wise. I found Connor as a protagonist to be insufferably uninteresting. Furthermore, some twists in the plot didn't really make much sense to be there, often being snookered by the history, so they just don't get developed. Why snooker yourself with that? You know what the history is. You can develop a plot that respects that and allows the game to actually act on it. The game certainly shoots itself in the foot with this. Gameplay wise, Assassin's Creed 3 moved towards being more animation based than the franchise was before. As a result, the combat finds itself being a bit more tedious if you struggle to build up a combo. However, I wouldn't say it's necessarily more challenging. The combat can look good, but to play it can sometimes just be a little annoying. The parkour no longer allows for cancels, which makes it much slower. And the introduction of tree running is pretty cool, but there isn't too much freedom of direction. You just sort of have to follow the paths the trees leave. This game is also the first to introduce naval to Assassin's Creed, and though it was improved in Black Flag, it was honestly quite painful in this game. The best thing about Assassin's Creed 3, however, are the Haytham sequences at the beginning. Beyond this, Assassin's Creed 3 side content isn't awful, but finds itself wanting. While not being especially broken, the game looks and feels like it wasn't finished when it launched. The thing that really tanks Assassin's Creed 3 altogether, though, has to be the ending. The ending for this game is probably the turning point for the franchise's direction. Before Assassin's Creed 3, the games were playing with an easy to follow, yet equally mysterious and fun narrative. But 3 really shakes it up at the very end for the games that followed to either do well with minor bits, or just fuck around and create a big plot issue and defocus the entire Assassin's Creed story. The catastrophe that is the messy storytelling in Assassin's Creed can therefore be traced back to this game. In my review for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I said that it makes the most of being a broken mess, which is both accurate talking about the game individually and the franchise that it's a part of. By 2020, the brand had no identity at all after the bollocks pulled off in Odyssey, and yet the game, though it's a lot of faff, does a lot to wrap up a lot of the plots left unfinished over the years, such as the Adam and Eve stuff and Layla Hassan's senseless arc, for example. It serves its purpose well with quality writing from Doug McDevitt and company, doubling down on some of the less favoured Assassin's Creed storytelling points and drawing a focal point to an acceptable head, albeit it's still a bit too mental for my taste. Valhalla has its fair share of brilliant moments. In the modern day, there are audio files of Desmond talking about the Creed, and then there's the entire Vinland arc, which I'm also a huge fan of. The game has a brilliant soundtrack, some lovely visuals and semi-decent characters from time to time, but unfortunately from here on out the game does become pretty dead average. Valhalla finds itself to be plagued by a lot of the same issues that Odyssey suffered from. The gameplay is often uninteresting and basic. The presence of a microtransaction store suggests that Ubisoft sees Assassin's Creed as little more than a cash cow, and a fair amount of gameplay features are tilted to make the microtransactions seem appealing. The gameplay is far too similar to Origins and Odyssey, which honestly felt a little bit expired by the end of Origins, let alone Odyssey, and certainly let alone now. The end result being the game feels tired before you've even picked it up. Furthermore, why is the game so fucking long? The complaint off the back of Odyssey was that the game was too much grind and not much story. The game doesn't solve that issue, it just hides it. We get the same amount of grind, but now it's mandatory as a part of the main story, even if it doesn't actually make sense and only completely buzzkills the story's momentum. The hours you spend doing stuff you feel has no meaning in this game hasn't decreased. If anything, it's increased. It's just hidden in the main story now. I guess a game that takes 12 hours to finish doesn't make microtransactions selling time savers and armor packs very appealing, does it? A common response to this critique that always baffles me is,
"You clearly haven't read the Icelandic sagas."
I guess the argument is that these Norse sagas are structured as short stories and that's what the story wanted to model itself after. However, that would have been fine had the game respected the player's time. I would say a lot of these seemingly unrelated arcs are fine as they are, but they would function a lot better as optional side content that plays into the narrative rather than mandatory arcs that break down pivotal moments. The gender choice for Eivor makes no sense, as female Eivor is canon and male Eivor is only there because Eivor is a sage of Odin, and so male Eivor is just Odin imposed over Eivor. All of that explaining because Ubisoft didn't want to make a solo female lead game, as they believe women don't sell. If you don't know what I mean, where have you been hiding for this past year? The character suffers for this unnecessary split. I also found Valhalla to be a Viking game first, and Assassin's Creed game not even second but like 17th. This game is a million things beyond being Assassin's Creed, which is so strange to me. Why is Assassin's Creed 5% assassins and 95% Vikings? Or Greek eagle-bearing mercenaries, Medjay and so on. Ubisoft don't care about making Assassin's Creed games anymore, they just use the brand to sell their historical RPG fantasy games. And writing that tries its best to tell something that resembles an Assassin's Creed story in some capacity really doesn't do enough to keep Valhalla in line with the franchise's identity from the years gone. People will say at least it's better than the games that I've already listed, but I think I was ultimately still underwhelmed by Valhalla. It's clear to me that Ubisoft doesn't really want to be making Assassin's Creed games anymore. Ubisoft's approach to making historical RPGs is harming Assassin's Creed just as much as Assassin's Creed is harming those RPGs. Ubisoft needs to decide whether or not they want to make Assassin's Creed games or historical fantasies where the main focus is the historical setting. And if it turns out to be the latter, they really need to stop calling it Assassin's Creed. Yes, franchises have to evolve, it's the nature of the industry. If they don't, they die. But there's a difference between being evolved and being unrecognizable. Consider the game's placement on this list a testament to the heart and soul that clearly went into the writing of the story. Because the quality's there, it's just a massive shame that the game doesn't do it justice. Assassin's Creed Origins used to be much higher on this list, but a realisation has struck me now that Valhalla's out and it's clear that Odyssey wasn't some outlier. Origins is arguably where Assassin's Creed broke away from its original format, and while in itself I quite like it, I find it to be riddled with a lot of issues that Valhalla and Odyssey also had. I believe that Origins benefits massively from the magical setting that is ancient Egypt. It doesn't need over-the-top high fantasy elements to feel magical, it just is. Of course there are some of those in there, but there's nowhere near as many as there is in Valhalla. And then beyond the awesome setting, we have the absolutely stellar performance from Abu Bakr Salim as Bayek of Siwa. Origins shows the birth of the Brotherhood very loosely, but we don't get to see the assassin ideology form beyond the odd principle. Honestly, Bayek's story needed a sequel, which it didn't get, and as a result of this, Origins itself falls a little flat. We aren't really an assassin in this game at all, which would have been fine were it a one-off, but it's become something of a recurring theme ever since. There is plenty to love about Origins, but from a gameplay perspective I think it strips back a lot of the core Assassin's Creed elements as well. There's no social stealth, parkour and climbing is just a slow animation rather than a traversal puzzle of timing and efficiency. The stealth gameplay is watered down in favour of combat. The hidden blade no longer instant killed and thus stealth was often impossible. Guard detection was instantaneous rather than a 3-stage system of being visible, being suspicious and being detected. As a result, all stealth actions were now just a means to find a way into combat rather than a means to avoid being in combat altogether. Content in this game could also get quite repetitive, with a lot of side missions being dedicated to simply rescuing people. The game also had microtransaction problems, overpriced gear packs in the store. It's clear that even then Ubisoft valued monetization over the integrity of their game, and that's not something I can easily forget. The DLCs in this game are good fun. Curse of the Pharaohs is a bit too fantasy-ish really, but in itself it would have been fine when mythological fantasy not then made a huge part of the following games. And the Hidden Ones furthers the origin story of the Assassins, but even now I feel like Assassin's Creed Origins has a really poor naming because it's only really part of an origin story, the rest of which we'll probably never see. Beyond all this, there really is a lot to like about Assassin's Creed Origins, but to me it really is a shame that ever since Assassin's Creed has really struggled to find its own identity. Now it's time to talk about the game responsible for the whole thing, Assassin's Creed. the first one. People look back and will say it's old and dated, and while it's certainly not looking like it came out yesterday, I'd argue that it's only natural that Assassin's Creed would have at least technologically advanced beyond it, what with it being the first installment. This is a game that was responsible for getting so many of us hooked back when it released in 2007. The gameplay is fun and well paced, the mysterious storyline was incredibly baffling as intended, and it introduced a cool sci-fi concept that made the whole franchise stand out. The atmosphere in this game is also insanely good. Of course it has aged, and some of the objectives could get a little repetitive, but I don't think I could ever tire from replaying this gem of a game, or any of the games that are higher up on the list. Furthermore, I feel there are some Assassin's Creed elements in Assassin's Creed 1 that no game in the franchise since has done quite so masterfully, though many of them have tried. Ultimately, Assassin's Creed 1 is a game full of charms that I honestly have a lot of love for. People will often say that Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag is not a true Assassin's Creed game, that it's too pirate focused. I get it, but I would disagree. Black Flag is not only an Assassin's Creed game, but it's a bloody brilliant one. Sure, it was the first time the outsider concept got fielded, and recently it's become less of an individual game gimmick and more of an expected disconnect, but for the purpose of this title, it worked really well. Edward is not an assassin for the most of the game. He's a pirate. The story shows us how his pursuit for riches causes him great losses, and how his character develops from a selfish pirate to a selfless assassin. Along the way, Darby McDevitt's ability to masterfully write characters is on full display. The game isn't flawless, some of that plot is a little bit crammed towards the end of the game, and gameplay wise it suffers from a lot of issues that Assassin's Creed 3 had. Furthermore, there's simply far too many tailing missions, my god, and yet I'd still take that over fetch quests any day of the week. And unlike other games in the franchise where the focus is heavily on the historical aspect, being a pirate in Black Flag is actually really good fun. Taking the jackdaw out and plundering ships never gets old, but even despite the pirate focuses, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag does not forget that it's Assassin's Creed. That's still very much so an integral part of the gameplay and story. Edward Kenway as a main protagonist is an absolutely brilliant character, and the supporting cast in Black Flag is honestly without equal in the entire franchise. As for the open world, there's content in this game that actually feels worth doing. There's plenty of plundering and treasure to be found to appetise those who wanted the pirate fantasy more, and there are plenty of Assassin's Creed related side storylines for you to go out of your way and find. The beautifully vibrant Caribbean open world is a lovely change of scenery from the greys and browns of Assassin's Creed 3 that came before it, and the soundtrack to boot is absolutely brilliant. There's so much to love about Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag that I think I'll have to revisit it in a video really, but my god, what a brilliant game. In all my years of gaming, few stories have ever reduced me to genuine tears, but Assassin's Creed Revelations is one of those games. Usually the final entry to a long-running character's story is either somewhat satisfying or a little bit meh, and every now and then it'll be utter dogwank. But when it came to the conclusion of Ezio's story, Revelations absolutely nails it. Darby McDevitt's masterful writing is on full display once more, concluding the stories of Ezio Auditore and Altair ibn La'ahad with absolute brilliance. From even very early on in playing it, this game gives you a feeling that this is the last adventure that we're going to have with Ezio, and at no point really does this last ride really drop below brilliant. Sure, the open world of Constantinople is far from my favourite, but Revelations does so much right that it doesn't matter. We see the end of Ezio's character development. We saw him as a youth in Assassin's Creed 2, we saw him find his place in the Creed in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, and now we just see him come to the end of his journey as an assassin. We also get to see snippets of the later life of Altair, and then we get to see the two legendary assassins that we've played as connect. The plot functioning as a culmination of Assassin's Creed so far, which it does both in the historical aspect and in the modern day. Gameplay wise, Revelations was very similar to Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood, but the thing that makes it stand out are the set pieces, which in this game are absolutely tremendous. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the set pieces in Assassin's Creed Revelations are perhaps the best in the entire franchise. Revelations also has one of the best soundtracks in the entire franchise as well, and perhaps one of my favourite video game soundtracks of all time. And ultimately, even though this year it's approaching 10 years old, Revelations to me is just a timeless, cracking ride that is just as fun to play now as it was back in 2011. Assassin's Creed 2 marks the beginning of Ezio's story. I'd say it's arguably the most visually aged of the games, even more so than Assassin's Creed 1, but the game itself still holds up pretty firmly. It has the player agency of the gameplay in Assassin's Creed 1 through Revelations, that much we know. The combat's a touch slower paced but requires more patience and timing, but really what Assassin's Creed 2 does that makes it this high up on the list is nothing to do with any of that really. I mean partially. But it's mostly down to the story, which I think is absolutely fantastic. Granted, the revenge story's been done a few times since, and has since lost its charm, but as the first chapter of the Ezio trilogy, it really does work quite well. Another thing that drew me a lot to Assassin's Creed 2 and my love for it has to be the historical setting itself. Renaissance Italy is a setting rife with a sense of mystery. As we play this game, all the history and passing is intriguing. How much information we can learn in the database of this game is fantastic. When I first played through this game, however many years ago it was, I genuinely felt immersed in it. And just like the other games in the Ezio trilogy and Assassin's Creed 1, I've played them so many times that I couldn't actually give you a rough number, let alone a specific one. Because to me this game is so brilliant that within reason it just never gets old. In the number 1 spot now, we have got Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. I know it used to be 2, and depending on the day you ask me, it could still be 2. It's one of those things where it depends on how I'm feeling. Is it Assassin's Creed Brotherhood? Is it Assassin's Creed 2? Sometimes it's Revelations. Truth be told, I find it hard to split the Ezio trilogy up into 3 games, because it feels like one solid experience. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood sees Ezio come to understand the importance of the Brotherhood, also taking his place as the mentor. The story is a fantastic middle part for Ezio and shows him in his prime. But the real thing that brings Brotherhood so far up is how it treats and handles the side content. If you wanted to just jam the story out, you can, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. But Rome is full of optional side content that fleshes out the narrative in a lot of ways. The Romulus tombs, Leonardo's war machines, the Christina memories, the courtesan assignments, the thief assignments, the assassinations, the Templar layers, renovating Rome itself and liberating all the districts. It may not affect the narrative, but it feels relevant to it. With the modern day, we can exit the Animus at any time and learn information from Sean, have dialogue interactions outside of this with Rebecca and Lucy, and explore Montergione at night as Desmond. And there are some cool details in the modern day to find that definitely make exploring it worth it. Back in the Animus, there's the mystery left behind by the glyphs, which ties into the modern day in a way. The overarching sense of mystery is kept alive, and on top of that, the narrative throws down some serious what the fuck moments, which definitely piqued my interest before we went into Assassin's Creed Revelations. This is also the only game where Assassin's Creed has really only stuck to one setting for more than one game, with it still being set in the Italian Renaissance, albeit in a different city. This to me proves that Assassin's Creed isn't necessarily at its best when it showcases a flashy new historical setting, but rather when it provides the means and justification for player investment in characters, in a story, something I feel modern Assassin's Creeds have somewhat lost sight of, but in my opinion the proof that investment in characters is much more important than having a fancy new setting every game is embodied by the Ezio trilogy, and that's why I feel like out of the 3 Ezio games, Brotherhood is a safe bet for the number 1 spot. And that brings us to the end of my Assassin's Creed ranking video. Of course, everything I've said in this video up until this point is in my opinion. I am by no means stating fact, nor do I want to change your opinions on the games. Do you agree with my list? Do you disagree? How much do you agree/disagree? I'd love to know your opinions down in the comment section, of course, though do be cautious on your way down there, because if World War III is going to begin anywhere, it's in the comment section of an Assassin's Creed ranking video. And if you do find yourself very angry by my Assassin's Creed ranking video, which means nothing online, then please do leave a comment about it, because I love taking screenshots of them and sharing them with my friends. Once more, it has been a pleasure talking to you about Assassin's Creed, but this is where the video must end. So, thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to go ahead and leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends and all that wonderful stuff, that would be super fantastic. If you want to be involved in more real-time conversations with me, the best place to find me will be while I'm streaming over on Twitch, which of course you will find via a link in the description if you so wish to check it out. I find myself playing a variety of games over there, which I'm sure will only just get more and more expansive as we go along, and so if you wish to see me playing all sorts of games over there, then definitely check that out. But of course, with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point. But until next time, do take care, and goodbye.